bitter wind howled across the vast white fields outside Winterfell, carrying with it a chill more profound than any ordinary winter storm. The snow was bone-dry and seemed to rasp against armor, cheeks, and the naked branches of twisted old trees. The sky had deepened to a dulled gray, tinged with sickly green, suggesting ill omens that no one could quite articulate. The North had known cold for millennia, but never had it known a chill like this, for death itself walked amid the drifts. The Night King was on the march, and at his side roamed not just one undead dragon, but two. Viserion, once golden-white and fierce, and Rhaegal, emerald-hued and proud. Both had fallen under his dominion. With them, the others soared, unstoppable, like nightmares cast against a swirling winter sky. Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, stood atop the highest parapet of Winterfell's outer walls, a thick fur cloak drawn tight around her shoulders. Despite the layers of wolf pelts and heavy wool, an inner chill settled in her bones that no hearth fire could banish. She was flanked by Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen as she now knew him to be, but it brought her no comfort. His presence was both a reminder of love and a burden of secrets. She could see the tension in the lines around his eyes as he stared out beyond the walls. Though the height of the battlements shielded them from the wind's worst fury, the occasional gust would leap over stone merlons, sending a spray of frost into their faces. The armies of the living had gathered within the castle. Men of the North, Knights of the Vale, loyal unsullied ranks, and even some Dothraki who'd survived the long night's earlier battles. Yet their morale was stretched to a frayed edge. They had lost many, more than anyone dared to count openly, and the knowledge that two dragons now served the Night King weighed on every heart. The living had once commanded 3 dragons. Now the Night King commanded 2, and Daenerys had only Drogon remaining. The blood of the dragon burned hot in her, but it was tempered by grief and fear. Far below, in the courtyard, Arya Stark was sharpening her dagger of Valyrian steel, her precise, quick movements betraying no sense of dread. Her breath clouded the air in short, sharp bursts. Next to her stood Sansa Stark, wrapped in gray fox furs, her face set in a calm mask. She watched the men at arms scurrying about, distributing weapons of dragonglass and whitesbane. Bran Stark sat near the weirwood tree, close-eyed, though no one could ever tell where his mind roamed. He could peer through time and space in ways that unsettled all who knew him. Ever since he had become the three-eyed raven, an otherworldly quality clung to him, as though part of him already dwelled beyond mortal concerns. The plan that night was desperate. They had to catch the army of the dead off guard, if that were even possible, and isolate the Night King. Yet with 2 undead dragons under his thrall, Daenerys wondered if any strategy could hold. The next hours would reveal the truth. Night fell swiftly, and with it came a deafening hush, as though the wind itself knew to still in the presence of its master. High above Winterfell's ramparts, the clouds parted to reveal a moon as pale as bone. Not long after, a shadow moved across that moon. Then 2 shapes with great wings, silent but for the occasional rasping cry that echoed through the gloom. Guards on the walls spotted them instantly and sounded horns. All across Winterfell, torches flared, and the defenders hurried to their battlements. Jon Snow, standing with Daenerys, felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He'd seen Viserion breathing blue flame before. To imagine 2 undead dragons exhaling that eerie, unnatural fire was almost unthinkable. But the proof soared overhead, circling like vultures. Any moment the onslaught could begin. Across the courtyard, Grey Worm barked orders to the Unsullied, ensuring the formations held. The gates were sealed, the trenches dug, the catapults loaded with dragonglass-laden projectiles. Gendry had helped smith as many weapons as he could, forging arrowheads, spear tips, and scythe blades of black obsidian. Their only hope was that enough of that lethal stone would meet the army of the dead before they themselves were overwhelmed. Light glimmered off the polished black scales of Drogon, who perched near the southwestern battlements under Daenerys's watchful gaze. The mighty beast shifted restlessly, exhaling little bursts of smoke that dissipated in the cold air. She whispered to him in High Valyrian, her voice shaking with determination and sorrow. For Rhaegal was Drogon's brother, and the sense of that bond being turned against them weighed heavily upon her. Drogon sensed it too. He keened softly, wings fidgeting, as though struggling to decide between fear and rage. When the horn sounded the second time, it meant the White Walkers approached in large numbers. The ground itself seemed to quake beneath an immense, unseen weight. Jon and Daenerys exchanged a grim look, and Jon gestured for the guards to open a route so they could descend the stairs to the courtyard. There, they would mount Drogon, intending to meet the threat in the air if the moment arrived. An uneasy hush gripped the defenders. They braced for the wave of the dead. In the darkness, eerie glimmers appeared, hundreds, then thousands. Pale blue eyes, marching forward in silent ranks. Their tattered armor clinked faintly in the still night. Above them soared the White's new lords, Viserion and Rhaegal. Ice crystals gleamed along the dead dragon's wings, and frosty mist trailed from their jaws. Now and then, one of them unleashed a spout of that terrible blue flame on the open fields, leaving scorching ruts of blackened earth amidst the snow. Snow and ash swirled together. Inside Winterfell's main hall, Tyrion Lannister paced, mind racing with possible stratagems. Davos Seaworth stood beside him, less anxious in manner but equally sober. They had positioned archers along the walls with flaming arrows, though they all knew conventional flame meant little to the dead. It was the obsidian arrowheads that might make a difference. But the White Walkers were not known for walking mindlessly into death traps. The Night King manipulated them with cunning. Every ounce of mortal ingenuity would be tested. When the dead finally surged forward, they did so with a ferocity that even the wind seemed to shrink from. A wave of bodies, arms outstretched, each carrying rusted weapons or simply bare, clawing fingers. Catapults were released, sending arcs of dragonglass shards into their masses. The front lines of the Whites collapsed in an instant, limbs severed, skulls pierced, but the dead behind them continued, climbing over the fallen without pause. Arrows rained down, black tips glinting in the torchlight, finding the eyes, throats, and chests of the undead. Dozens more fell. Still, their ranks pressed on. Behind the throng, spectral riders on decayed horses, White Walkers with eyes like shards of glacial ice, guided the assault with silent commands. Far overhead, the undead dragons circled. At times, Rhaegal or Viserion swooped low, spewing blasts of blue fire that carved molten trenches through the earth. Men screamed and scattered. The odor of superheated stone and scorched flesh assaulted the defenders on the walls. A single pass from Rhaegal's rotting jaws set a portion of Winterfell's outer rampart ablaze with eerie, cold flames that refused to die quickly. Soldiers scrambled to contain it with mud and snow. From the courtyard, Daenerys and Jon climbed onto Drogon's back. One powerful flap of his wings lifted them above the ramparts. Grey Worm, seeing them ascend, shouted the signal for the next volley of catapults. The defenders needed to clear a path for Drogon to engage in an aerial battle. Arcs of blazing pitch and jagged obsidian soared through the gloom, forcing the Whites to scatter and even making the undead dragons swerve aside momentarily. With fierce roars, Drogon ascended. Daenerys clutched the harness, her breath catching in her throat as they rose to meet the monstrous forms of Viserion and Rhaegal. Jon, behind her, felt his heart pounding not just from fear, but from the heartbreak of seeing Rhaegal, a beast he once rode, turned against them. In the swirling blackness of the night, the two undead dragons turned their eyeless stares upon Drogon, and the battle in the sky began. Fire met ice flame in a dance of swirling embers and frigid gusts. Drogon breathed scorching yellow-red jets that lit the clouds with roiling fire. In response, Rhaegal bathed the darkness in shimmering blue arcs. The blasts collided in midair, sparks flying, creating pockets of boiling steam that clouded the battlefield. Jon shouted something to Daenerys, but it was lost in the roar of the dragons. Below, the Whites poured ever closer to Winterfell's walls, scaling them with spider-like persistence, hacking at defenders, tearing them to pieces. The living fought back, blade and arrow, dragonglass and steel, but for every White that fell, Two more seemed to crawl forth from the darkness behind it. To the west side of the castle, a series of horns signaled the breaching of the walls. The ramparts there had been hammered repeatedly by Viserion's flames, and a portion of the stone had weakened enough for the whites to climb over in greater numbers. Brienne of Tarth led a charge of knights to hold the breach, her Valyrian steel blade glowing in the torchlight. She cleaved through whites methodically, face set in unwavering resolve. Podrick Payne followed closely, dragging a wounded soldier behind him to the relative safety of a corner tower before rejoining the fray. Their blades flashed, sending bones and rotted flesh flying, but the swarm was immense. The defenders were pushed back step by bloody step, even as the howls of the undead rose above the wind. Within the Godswood, the air had gone strangely still. Bran's eyes were white, his mind traveling elsewhere. He saw not just the battle raging outside, but glimpses of ages past. The first long night, the forging of the Valyrian steel swords, the forging of the Night King's monstrous link to the living world. He tried to focus on the present to locate the Night King. Was he among the White Walkers on the field, or astride one of his foul dragons? Bran's sight darted from vantage point to vantage point. A swirl of ravens in the sky, direwolves prowling on the ground, the parted vision of weirwood trees scattered across the north. At last, he spotted a towering figure astride an undead horse, gliding forward behind the lines of the White Walkers. The Night King had not yet unleashed the full force of his presence. He was waiting, watching, perhaps anticipating that Daenerys and Jon would engage his dragons while he moved to claim Winterfell itself. Arya, done preparing her weapons, slipped through the shadows of the courtyard. She had become adept at navigating the chaos of battle unseen. With practiced stealth, she climbed a flight of stone steps to an upper wall where the whites had broken through. There, she plunged her dragonglass dagger into skull after skull. But it wasn't enough to stem the tide. A white nearly seized her arm. She twisted free and stabbed it through the eye, then kicked its tumbling body off the wall. Gritting her teeth, she took in the battered defenders around her. She motioned for them to form up, then she vanished again, searching for vantage points and any sign of the Night King. Sansa Stark, from a vantage in the Great Hall, commanded lines of support, runners ferrying extra weapons, medics tending to the wounded. She had argued with Daenerys about going to the crypts, but eventually had relented that leading from a safer spot was the wisest course. Even there, cold fear snaked into her chest. She could hear the shrieks of the dying, the roar of the dragons, the thunder of catapults, all that echoed through the Great Hall, along with the knowledge that if the walls truly fell, the hall would become a slaughterhouse in a matter of moments. Outside, in the swirling darkness, the aerial battle reached a violent crescendo. Drogon raked at Viserion's undead flesh, talons peeling away layers of decaying scales. In turn, Viserion snapped at Drogon's neck, a savage clash of jaws and teeth. Searing flame met frigid cold. Streaks of lightning-like energy pulsed where the unnatural flames collided. Rhaegal, reanimated and horrifying with one wing partially shredded and replaced by glimmering ice, crashed into Drogon from behind, nearly unseating Daenerys and Jon. With a roar that shook the heavens, Drogon twisted around and bit at Rhaegal's throat. The undead dragon exhaled a torrent of chilling fire that scorched Drogon's side and made him recoil. He spun wildly in the air, losing altitude as his wings struggled to steady themselves. Jon held tight to Daenerys's waist, trying to keep her from tumbling off Drogon's saddle. He spotted a flash of pale light on the ground below, a tall, gaunt figure radiating an icy aura. The Night King was dismounting his dead steed, standing now behind the ranks of White Walkers. He lifted a hand, and the nearest whites parted like water around a stone, revealing the battered forms of dead Northerners from earlier battles, already reanimated. Daenerys urged Drogon forward in a desperate push. She knew if the Night King reached the castle gates, a swift and brutal end would follow. Drogon soared again, ignoring the scorch marks along his scales. They banked around for a final charge, but Viserion slammed into them from the side, jaws open. Blue fire spat out, catching a portion of Drogon's wing. Drogon screeched in agony, black scales glowing hot along the edges where the unnatural flame licked. Still, Daenerys commanded him onward, determined to burn the Night King from existence. They plunged downward, flames streaming from Drogon's maw, aiming for the spot where the Night King stood. The White Walkers scattered to avoid the dragonfire. But the Night King merely lifted both arms, as if greeting an old friend. The aura around him shimmered. Icy winds gusted upward, a barrier that deflected Drogon's flames just enough for him to remain unscathed. With a flick of his wrist, the Night King hurled a spear of ice. Drogon twisted wildly, but the weapon grazed his flank. He roared as chunks of black scale and flesh tore free, spattering the ground with hot blood. Jon saw the ground rushing up. Daenerys clung to Drogon's harness. The injured dragon had lost control. He crashed onto the battlefield in a thunderous impact that shook the very foundations of Winterfell's walls. The earth split in places, white snow turning dark with mud and dragon's blood. Daenerys and Jon were thrown from the saddle, landing painfully amid the churned ground and twisted bodies of the dead. Everything went momentarily silent in Jon's ears, save for his own harsh breathing. He rolled onto his knees and saw Daenerys coughing, trying to regain her footing. Drogon groaned, pinned under his own injured wing. From the swirling haze of snow and ash, the Night King appeared, calm and methodical. In that instant, Jon thought to charge him to bury Longclaw Valyrian steel into the heart of the enemy. But from above, another roar echoed. Rhaegal was descending, jaws wide, ready to incinerate them with the blue flame. Jon sprinted to Daenerys, pulling her upright, and together they stumbled away from Drogon's bulk just as Rhaegal let out a torrent of undead fire that bathed the area in a caustic glow. The ground sizzled, smoke rising. Drogon, pinned and helpless, roared in defiance as the flames reached him. Daenerys cried out, horror in her voice, but the raging swirl of violence smothered everything else. She tried to run back toward her dragon, but Jon held her arm. A second gust of frost-laced fire erupted. Through the haze, they could not see Drogon anymore, only a great shape thrashing, roaring, and then falling silent. Smoke and swirling embers obscured it all. Daenerys screamed, the sound ragged and heartbroken. The Night King advanced, ice spear forming in his grasp. Rhaegal landed behind him with a thud that shook the air. The undead dragon's eyes glowed that eerie blue, steam trailing from its half-rotten nostrils. Jon stepped between Daenerys and the Night King, raising Longclaw. A memory rushed into his mind of that first time he fought a White Walker at Hardhome, how their preternatural strength and speed overwhelmed ordinary men. But he no longer had fear. If this was where he died, so be it. The Night King's mocking gaze flicked briefly to the Valyrian steel sword. Then he lunged. His spear came around in a powerful sweep. Jon parried, the clash reverberating in a clang that almost numbed his arms. The air around them crackled with the chill of the grave. Daenerys scrambled back, fumbling for a dragonglass dagger at her belt. She looked up in time to see Rhaegal's huge form looming, half hoping some stray arrow might pierce the beast's dead heart. But no arrows came. The defenders were too pressed at the walls, or had no line of sight to help. This moment was theirs alone. Jon deflected another brutal strike. Frost spiraled out from each clash, coating Longclaw's hilt with a thin sheen of ice that made his grip precarious. The Night King fought with calculated precision, each blow seeking to knock Jon off balance or force him into the range of a lethal strike. Jon pressed in, calling upon every ounce of skill from years of training under the watch of Castle Black's old masters. Time felt suspended, each heartbeat a thunderclap. Meanwhile, Daenerys crept around, scanning for an opening. A wave of despair threatened to overwhelm her as she recalled Drogon's agonized screams. Yet she could not afford to succumb to grief. She was the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the unburnt, and if she let sorrow claim her, all would be lost. She inched forward, holding the dragonglass blade. The Night King was preoccupied with Jon's steel. Perhaps she could strike from behind. But the Night King seemed aware of everything. In a blur, he spun, lashing out with a backhand that sent Daenerys sprawling. The ice spear came around to finish her, but Jon threw himself between them, intercepting the blow with Longclaw. Sparks of frost flew, and Longclaw was knocked from Jon's grip. The sword fell several feet away, half buried in blackened snow. The Night King's gaze locked onto Jon's face. With inhuman speed, he kicked Jon's knee out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The ice spear was raised, and in that fleeting moment Jon thought of Ghost, of the Stark crypts, of Arya and Sansa and Bran, and of his father Eddard Stark. He closed his eyes, bracing for an end he could not stop. A furious scream tore through the air. Arya Stark materialized out of the darkness, leaping with her dagger angled for the Night King's neck. She nearly reached him, but he twisted aside at the last instant, catching her wrist. The motion was fluid, unervingly graceful. He flung Arya aside, slamming her into the half-frozen mud. Her breath whooshed out, and she fought to reorient herself. The dagger skittered away. In that precious second, Daenerys seized on the distraction. She had crawled within reach of Longclaw. With a cry torn from her very soul, she swung the Valyrian steel blade upward at the Night King's midsection. The shock of steel biting into the creature's ancient flesh sent cracks of shimmering ice across his torso. He froze, glaring at her with malevolence. For an instant she thought he might shatter. Then a wave of cold burst outward from the wound, knocking her and Jon flat on their backs. The wind was slammed from their lungs. By the time Daenerys blinked the frost from her eyes, she saw the Night King standing intact, though a fracture glowed ominously in his chest, letting out a faint blue glow. He reached down, snapped off a shard of ice from his own wound, and let it dissolve into the air like a puff of vapor. Then he advanced again. Beyond them the chaos raged. Whites had streamed through breaches in Winterfell's walls, meeting fierce resistance from the North's defenders. Blood and icy slush coated the ramparts. The courtyard was a maelstrom of swirling steel, rotted flesh, and flying obsidian shards. Sansa could be heard rallying those who remained near the Great Hall. Ser Brienne's voice boomed commands over the din on the western flank. Giants of the undead, battered from earlier battles, now lumbered forward to smash through what remained of the gates. The horrifying roars of Rhaegal and Viserion ripped the night sky, while far away, one could occasionally hear the echoing screams of men still valiantly trying to down the undead dragons with dragonglass-laden scorpions. Jon forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain that radiated through his side. He saw Arya, dazed, trying to stand. She had a trickle of blood along her temple, but still held a determined spark in her eyes. Daenerys was crawling toward Longclaw, out of breath but undeterred. The Night King raised the spear once more, aiming for Daenerys's exposed back. Jon lunged, tackling the Night King around the waist, grappling with an entity as cold and hard as a frozen statue. Frost blossomed across Jon's armor. His teeth rattled as the chill bit into his flesh. The Night King shoved Jon off with effortless strength. Jon crashed to the ground, vision hazy. Arya, seeing an opening, rolled forward to regain her dagger. She snatched it up, pivoting with an agile spin. The Night King barely turned in time to block her swipe. Each movement of his had a terrible elegance, as though he anticipated every attack. From behind, Daenerys, trembling with effort, raised Longclaw. She did not have the years of training a knight or assassin possessed, but she had desperation and rage fueled by loss. With a guttural sound, she brought the sword down. The Night King shifted at the last moment, twisting his torso so the blade bit into his left arm rather than his neck. The steel sliced through that ancient flesh, sending cracks running up into his shoulder. With his free hand, he backhanded Daenerys across the face, sending her sprawling again, blood on her lip. Arya sank her dagger into the back of his right knee. He staggered, but did not cry out. His inhuman face remained devoid of emotion. Instead, he spun, yanking the dagger free of his flesh and tossing it aside like a toy. A creeping wave of frost slithered along Arya's arm from the brief contact, making her gasp. She scrambled back, trying to regain footing. The Night King whipped his ice spear in a wide arc, forcing Arya and Daenerys both to dive away. Jon lunged from his vantage on the ground, wrestling for control of the Night King's weapon. But the creature's ancient strength prevailed. He forced Jon onto his back, spear tip hovering over Jon's throat, a swirl of cold radiating from that lethal point. Time slowed. Jon saw his own breath crystallizing in the air. The reflection of his wide, dark eyes flickered in the Night King's glassy visage. He felt the press of an otherworldly presence, a force older and darker than any mortal. Then from somewhere unseen, a single arrow zipped through the night, lodging itself in the Night King's torso where the earlier crack still glowed. A warbled hiss escaped his lips, and he faltered. Jon tore free from under the spear just enough to roll aside. There stood Bran Stark, crossbow in hand, an unlikely sight. But behind him hovered a small swirl of ravens, as though guiding him. Bran's face was as impassive as ever, though beads of sweat dotted his brow. The shot had not been made with lethal accuracy. The arrow was set awkwardly in the Night King's chest, yet it made the creature stagger. That momentary lapse was all Jon needed. He seized Longclaw from the snow where Daenerys had dropped it and rose up, driving the blade forward into the Night King's chest, aiming for the crack. The steel met resistance, as though piercing ancient ice. With a final push fueled by every last vestige of strength, Jon forced the blade into the hilt. A crystalline scream erupted from the Night King, high and piercing, echoing across the entire battlefield. Spiderweb fractures of glowing blue spread across his chest, up his neck, down his arms. Daenerys scrambled backward, eyes wide, shielding herself from the bright, cold light. Arya watched intently, dagger ready in case he did not fall. But this time, the Night King did not merely stand. He froze in place, his entire being beginning to break apart like shards of a shattered glacier. For a breath, there was hope. The White Walkers across the battlefield wavered, their forms flickering, the Whites stumbling mid-charge. A hush descended as watchers on both sides saw the Night King begin to disintegrate. Jon twisted Longclaw, pressing deeper. Another shriek cut through the air. Then, with a sudden flare of icy brilliance, the Night King exploded into fractals of snow and frost, scattering into the wind. A collective roar of triumph rose from the living. Even the undead dragons faltered overhead, swerving wildly. Many Whites collapsed where they stood, crashing to the ground as lifeless husks. The White Walkers crumbled as well, their armor clattering amidst piles of frost. Jon slumped to his knees, panting, battered. He felt Daenerys' hand on his shoulder. Arya stood behind them, dagger half-raised. They all looked at each other, stunned. Then a different shriek rent the air. Eerily, Rhaegal and Viserion still flew, although they now seemed disoriented. One might have expected them to vanish with the Night King's demise. But something lingered in them, some dark magic that refused to relent. They shrilled in confusion, tearing at the sky in sweeping arcs. A large number of Whites had fallen inert, but others still twitched and rose again, as though part of a second wave. The three watchers on the ground stared in disbelief. Could it be that the Night King's hold was replaced by something else? Or had the presence of these undead dragons become a new anchor for the darkness? The defenders of Winterfell, momentarily elated, found themselves beset again, as a portion of the Whites still stood. Not as many as before, but enough to continue the killing. The Whites' eyes glowed a fainter blue, as though the magic animating them was weaker yet still active. In the sky, Rhaegal's hollow shriek resonated, taking on a new form. A swirl of frost-laden wind accompanied the beast's flight, and the living realized that the threat was far from over. The Great Other's power, whatever foul deity or force that had spawned the White Walkers, did not die with the Night King alone. Something else was stirring in that unearthly bond. Exhaustion threatened to break Daenerys. She had just seen Drogon fall under the scorching blue flame, and only adrenaline kept her from collapsing. But she could not let it end like this. She looked to Jon, who was struggling to stay upright. Arya took a position near them, her slight frame trembling but still fierce. Bran stood a few steps back, crossbow lowered, an odd calm on his face. Daenerys's voice was raw. "We need to see if Drogon still lives. If—" Her voice caught. "We still need him. We cannot let those other two remain in the sky unchallenged." Jon nodded, swallowing back fear and heartbreak. "If Drogon is gone, we need another plan to bring down Viserion and Rhaegal." A new cacophony of noise erupted near Winterfell's main gate. The battered gates finally gave way under the weight of the undead giants. The whites swarmed in, though their numbers were halved from before. Brienne's forces were exhausted, pressed back. Tormund Giantsbane, face streaked with blood, roared in fury as he sank an axe into a white's ribcage. He and a cluster of wildlings fought with savage desperation. Tyrion Lannister stood atop a portion of the damaged wall, tossing dragonglass bombs that Gendry had crafted. The bombs shattered on impact, sending shards in all directions, tearing through the whites. But the wave was relentless. Jon gripped Longclaw and shouted, "We hold Winterfell, even if it costs our last breath. We hold it." Daenerys inhaled, mustering the last of her strength. "We need to find Drogon, or do something about those other dragons before they destroy what's left." Arya glanced at the flickering undead dragons overhead, then back at Jon. "Go. I'll help hold the courtyard." Bran took a step forward. "I will try to warg into something that can help. Possibly into one of the dragons, or ravens to distract them." His distant tone betrayed no emotion, only a sense of duty. Jon looked at him in alarm. "Is that safe?" Bran's gaze drifted. "There's no time to discuss safety now." And with that, his eyes turned white. The world for Bran Stark vanished into a swirl of black and swirling snow. He found himself in the sky, a flock of ravens at his command. He soared upward, searching for the swirling shapes of the undead dragons. Jon and Daenerys began moving, half limping, toward the smoking crater where Drogon had crashed. They skirted around the edges of pitched battles, weaving through the carnage. Grey Worm and the Unsullied still formed defensive lines, though their ranks were heartbreakingly diminished. Daenerys offered them a nod, her eyes bright with unshed tears, even as she pressed on. Corpses littered the ground, some stirring back to half-life by the residual necromancy. A grunt of disgust escaped Jon as he impaled one reanimated soldier with a swift thrust. At the center of a wide trench of scorched earth lay Drogon. His massive form partially collapsed against the remains of Winterfell's stable towers. Steam rose from his sides, and an acrid smell stung the air. Daenerys ran forward, ignoring the danger of stepping between the dragon's wings. Her heart pounded. First, she saw no movement. Then Drogon's flank rose and fell in a ragged breath. Daenerys let out a choked sob, pressing her hands gently to the creature's bloodied muzzle. One of his great red eyes blinked, though it was clouded with pain. Cuts and burns streaked his scales. Ice-cold scorch marks marred him where Rhaegal's breath had hit. He rumbled weakly. Jon pressed a hand to Drogon's neck, feeling the trembling life that still lingered. "He's alive." Relief washed over his features. He glanced up at Daenerys. "But he's in no condition to fight. If he tries to fly again—" "I know," Daenerys said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But we have to protect him until he can recover. If we can." A thunderous roar in the distance drew their attention. Rhaegal and Viserion were circling again, unleashing blasts of azure flame at the living who dared to raise weapons from the battlements. The scorpions that Qyburn once devised for King's Landing had been replicated in smaller scale by Gendry, but they were clumsy, hard to aim in the swirling chaos. If they landed a shot with a dragonglass bolt, it could bring a dragon down. But the success rate was low, and the operators were pinned behind collapsed towers and half-broken walls, with the undead still streaming inside. Jon clenched his fists. "We must do something. If they remain overhead, we can't last." Daenerys swallowed the lump in her throat, looking from Drogon's wounded form to the swirling silhouettes in the sky. "Then we take them down on foot if we have to." "That would be suicide," Jon replied grimly. "Unless—" He paused, scanning the battlefield. Through the drifting snow and smoke, he saw Samwell Tarly near one of the scorpions. struggling to load a massive dragonglass bolt. "There," Jon said, pointing. Daenerys nodded, setting her jaw. "We get to Sam. We help him aim. If we can kill one of them, perhaps the other will fall." A powerful gust of wind and the beating of wings announced the arrival of Rhaegal overhead, as though the undead beast sensed their presence. Both Jon and Daenerys dove aside as a column of blue fire struck the ground, scorching a black path across the battlefield. Drogon let out a pained shriek, shifting to protect himself. Ice crystals formed in the air where the flame dissipated, swirling fragments of unnatural frost. Jon signaled for Daenerys to follow him at a low crouch. They skirted around smoking rubble, passing by the bodies of men and women they knew, some from the Vale, some Dothraki, some Stark bannermen. Near the remains of a broken wagon, Tyrion Lannister suddenly appeared, coughing from the smoke. "You're alive," he exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. Then worry took over as he noticed Daenerys's tear-streaked face. "Your Grace," he said with urgency. "Are you injured?" She shook her head, pointing to the circling undead dragons. "We have to bring them down. Is anyone still manning the scorpions?" Tyrion coughed, eyes wide. "Samwell is over there, I saw him. He nearly got roasted, but he's determined. Gendry was helping, but I lost track of him in the chaos. We need to hurry. They've overrun half the castle." "Help us get to Sam," Jon said, glancing warily at Rhaegal's shape overhead. "We'll hold them off as best we can." Tyrion swallowed hard. "Yes, of course." The trio dashed across the battlefield, sidestepping grappling wights and hacking at those who lunged in their path. Jon's sword was a blur, each swing severing limbs or decapitating undead heads. Daenerys wielded a shorter dragonglass blade, her earlier injuries making her movements sluggish. She fought fiercely nonetheless. Tyrion followed behind, bashing an occasional wight with a cudgel. His mouth was set in a grimace of determination. At last, they found Sam next to a battered scorpion that had been rigged onto a rotating base. The clumsy contraption bore a massive bolt tipped with multiple shards of dragonglass. Sam was breathing so hard he looked ready to faint, but his eyes were resolute. Dolorous Ed stood by him, fending off a small knot of wights with a spear of obsidian. Jon leaped in, slicing through the wights attacking Ed, while Tyrion helped Sam rotate the scorpion to aim at Rhaegal, who swooped low. Daenerys hovered near them, scanning the sky for Viserion, but the swirling snow made it difficult to see. If they could down Rhaegal first, they might reduce the threat overhead by half. "Now!" Jon shouted, once he saw an opening between swirls of smoke. Sam took a shaky breath and pulled the lever that would release the bolt. There was a guttural twang, and the great bolt streaked skyward. Rhaegal, perhaps alerted by some remnant of draconic instinct, twisted at the last second. The bolt struck the beast's shoulder joint rather than its chest or head. The undead dragon shrieked, dipping in flight. A hiss of blue flame erupted from its mouth, blasting the upper ramparts. The living scattered, some flung from the walls by the force. "It's wounded," Sam cried, face flushed. "We need another shot." But as they tried to reload, an enormous shape slammed down near them, Viserion. The undead dragon landed, its decaying wings beating in the wind, sending up clouds of ash and snow. It unleashed a horrifying screech, rearing back for a breath of frost flame. Jon flung himself in front of Sam, Tyrion, and Ed. Daenerys sidestepped to the scorpion, hands trembling on the reloading mechanism. The glow began in the back of Viserion's throat. Jon raised Longclaw, though he knew such a gesture was futile against a blast of dragonfire. Desperation set in. Then, overhead, a swirl of ravens appeared. They dove in front of Viserion's face, flapping and cawing, momentarily blinding the undead beast. The breath of frostfire exploded wide, missing the scorpion by scant feet. Bran's influence, no doubt. Seizing the distraction, Daenerys yanked the lever. The half-loaded bolt shot out in a raw, clanking spasm of the scorpion's mechanism. It flew wide, only grazing Viserion's flank. The dragon reeled, thrashing in rage, swiping with a claw that smashed a portion of the scorpion's wooden frame. Jon rolled aside, yelling at the others to scatter. Splinters rained down, and the scorpion was half ruined. Tyrion coughed, holding his arm where a shard of wood had gashed him. Sam scrabbled for the reload lever, but it was broken. The scorpion's sinew cables snapped. Ed sank his spear into the leg of a wight that tried to climb over them, then turned, horror on his face as Viserion prepared another blast. At that moment, a deep roar shook the heavens. Drogon emerged from the darkness, battered, half limping on the ground, but still determined. With a fury that seemed drawn from Daenerys' own soul, the black dragon charged, leaping onto Viserion's flank. The undead dragon screeched, struggling to throw Drogon off. Their bodies slammed into the crumbling walls, taking out entire chunks of stone. People scattered. Men and women died beneath falling debris. Drogon's jaws clamped onto Viserion's neck. Blood, black and foul, spurted from the undead dragon's veins. Viserion twisted, burying its teeth into Drogon's shoulder, letting out a roar of icy flame. The two dragons writhed in a tangle of wings, tails, and savage fury. A thunderous snap echoed, and Viserion's neck broke with a sickening crack under Drogon's jaws. The undead beast shrieked once more, then collapsed in a heap, flickering with a final spasm of cursed energy. Drogon roared in victory, but it was short-lived. He too slumped to the ground, racked by injuries. The combined agony of his wounds overcame him. He heaved a few shallow breaths, then collapsed against the rubble, tail twitching feebly. Daenerys watched in despair, tears freezing on her cheeks. As she sprinted toward Drogon's massive head, she placed a hand on his muzzle, trying to comfort him, whispering broken words in Valyrian. Drogon let out a faint rumble, eyelids heavy. Jon, panting, joined her, but the respite was brief. Another roar split the air. Rhaegal, still undead and maddened, soared overhead. Steam and frost trailed from the hole in its shoulder, courtesy of Sam's first scorpion shot. Weakened, but not defeated, it circled, looking for a target. The battered defenders of Winterfell tried to regroup. The wights remaining on the ground were fewer now, their movements sluggish, as if the partial death of Viserion had severed some tether. But Rhaegal's presence was like a keystone of the residual necromancy. Each time the undead dragon roared, the wights stiffened and carried on, continuing their assault with mindless aggression. Tyrion wiped blood from his brow, eyes darting for escape. "The castle won't survive much more of this," he said to Jon in a hoarse voice. "There must be a way to bring that last dragon down without losing everyone." Sam pointed at the remains of the scorpion. "We might be able to fix it or find another one." He paused, glancing around. "But Gendry built only a handful. I don't know if any remain." Daenerys stood, anger sharpening her features. "I won't let Rhaegal roam free like this. Drogon needs help, but if we do nothing, more will die." Her knuckles whitened on Longclaw's grip, which Jon had pressed into her hand moments earlier. "Let's find another scorpion," Jon said. "Tyrion, Sam, you stay here, see if Drogon can be tended to. Keep the wights off him. If we lose him, we lose everything." Tyrion nodded grimly. "I'll do what I can." He turned, barking commands to nearby soldiers, rallying them to form a defensive circle around the injured dragon. Jon turned to Daenerys. "We have to be careful. Rhaegal is still powerful." She said nothing, only gave a curt nod. Then they raced off. The courtyard was a ruin of collapsed stone and blood-soaked snow. Survivors huddled in small pockets, fighting off the last clusters of wights. The reanimated giants had been felled by dragonglass-laden catapults earlier, leaving massive corpses that formed obstacles in the yard. The battered great hall sagged from a corner where flames had licked up the timbers. Ghostly moans of wind drifted through. From high above, Rhaegal swooped, unleashing a lazy stream of frostfire along the battlements, as though marking territory. Amidst the swirling gloom, Brienne and Jaime Lannister, still alive, bloodied but unbroken, had taken command of a cluster of knights near the southwestern tower. They were trying to repurpose a scorpion that had been knocked off its stand. Nearby, Gendry knelt, furiously working on reattaching a snapped cable. The pair of Targaryens hurried toward them, weaving past scattered whites. Jon impaled one that lunged, and Daenerys beheaded another with a savage swing. A few minutes later, they arrived. Gendry glanced up, relief evident on his soot-stained face. "We're nearly done," he said through labored breaths. "This scorpion can still fire if we can just fix the pivot mechanism. Another cable or two, and we can angle it upward." Brienne wiped sweat from her brow, half her face streaked with black from soot. "Ser Jaime and I have been keeping the whites at bay. This is our best shot to kill that dragon." Jaime's left shoulder was splinted, blood seeping through the bandages, but his gaze was steady. "We could use an extra set of hands." He handed Daenerys a coil of sinew cable. "If you can help Gendry secure that, we might have a chance." Daenerys set to work, ignoring the throbbing pain of her bruises. She channeled her frustration and fear into the mechanical task, tying off cables as Gendry instructed. Jon, Brienne, and Jaime kept watch, occasionally fending off a stray white. Overhead, Rhaegal circled closer. "Ready," Gendry shouted, giving the pivot crank a test spin. The scorpion turned, albeit stiffly, but enough to aim at the swirling shape above. They had one massive bolt with a cluster of dragonglass shards, specially designed for the hardest scales. Gendry and Daenerys manned the crank to adjust elevation. Jaime held the final tension lever. The plan was simple. Wait for Rhaegal to come into range, loose the bolt, and pray. The dragon soared overhead once more. Jon squinted up, gauging the distance. The swirling snow made it difficult to measure altitude. "We need him closer," Jon said, voice tight. "He's too high to hit." They all waited, hearts pounding, as Rhaegal roared. The undead dragon circled widely, scanning the battlefield below with hateful blue eyes. Now and then, it spat a half-hearted plume of frostfire. Then it turned in a lazy arc, heading directly for their tower. Jon realized it was likely drawn to living targets or to the presence of the Valyrian steel that had wounded the Night King. "Steady," Brienne murmured to Daenerys and Gendry. "Wait!" Rhaegal's shape grew larger, the wind of its wings stirring the falling snow in eddies. Its maw began to glow that unnatural azure. If it got off a shot before they fired, the scorpion might be destroyed. They had to time this perfectly. Jaime's hand tightened on the lever. Daenerys nodded, adrenaline buzzing. "Now!" she shouted. Gendry yanked the release. The scorpion bolt hurled upward. In the same instant, Rhaegal unleashed a torrent of frost-blue flame. The bolt streaked through the fire, trailing vapors. With a sickening, echoing impact, it slammed into Rhaegal's chest, near where Sam's first shot had wounded him. The undead dragon shrieked, rearing back mid-air. Its beam of flame skewed, slicing through the tower's upper battlements but missing the scorpion's crucial mechanisms. A rush of triumph surged through them. Rhaegal flailed, losing altitude. The hole in its chest glowed with an ominous light, arcs of dark magic swirling around the embedded dragonglass. The beast tried to flap, but each movement sent waves of blackish ichor spurting from the wound. With a keening wail, it plummeted, crashing into the courtyard below, smashing stone and bodies alike in its descent. A massive cloud of dust and ice crystals billowed out, obscuring everything. "It's down," Gendry exclaimed, breathless. He almost collapsed with relief. Jon peered over the ledge. "We should confirm it's truly dead. The undead do not die easily." Brienne nodded. "I'll rally a group to check the courtyard." Jaime placed a hand on his brother's sword, using it for support. "I'll come," he said, ignoring the pain in his arm. Gendry and Daenerys, though exhausted, also followed, with Jon leading the way. They moved down winding stairs, stepping over rubble and bodies, until they reached the courtyard, now half filled with swirling dust and drifting embers. The shape of Rhaegal lay in the center, wings splayed out, one pinned beneath a collapsed portion of wall. The scorpion bolt still jutted from its chest. Smoke or steam poured from its jaws, mixing with an aura of swirling cold. As the dust settled, they saw the creature's eyes flicker. It was still animate, at least partially, the undead magic refusing to extinguish easily. Brienne moved first. Her Valyrian steel sword was raised, the battered lion sigil on her cloak fluttering. She approached from the side, while Jaime and Jon moved to flank. Gendry and Daenerys stayed back, scanning for any lingering wights. With a sudden spasm, Rhaegal's tail lashed out, knocking Jaime flat and sending Brienne staggering. Jon darted in, slicing across the wounded dragon's neck with long claw. The blade bit deep, sending out a wave of that sickly black fluid. The undead dragon convulsed, letting out a final, tortured scream. Then the light in its eyes flickered and died. His body sagged, collapsing fully into the rubble. Silence swallowed the courtyard. Snow drifted downward, settling on the broken stones and the battered defenders. No other roars tore the night. No wights clamored for blood. The last vestiges of the undead collapsed, lifeless. A hush so profound it seemed the world itself had paused. Slowly, across the castle grounds, survivors emerged from hiding, peering over ramparts, inching out from doorways. Torches flickered, revealing the battered faces of men and women who had witnessed the fall of not one, but two undead dragons. Relief mingled with sorrow, for the cost had been incalculable. Daenerys sank to her knees, exhaustion overtaking her. She stared at Rhaegal's lifeless form, remembering the day her dragons were born amid the pyre, recalling their hatching like a miracle of life. Now, two of her children lay dead by unnatural means, Viserion perverted by the Night King, and Rhaegal bound in that same dark magic. Only Drogon remained, gravely injured. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, trying not to sob openly in front of her people. Jon knelt beside her, gently placing an arm around her shoulders. He too was pale with shock, caked in blood and grime. For a long moment they said nothing. The swirl of snow and ash settled around them like a funeral shroud. Dawn, if it could be called that, arrived with a pale gray light that revealed the full extent of the devastation. Winterfell stood, but barely. Many sections of the outer wall had collapsed. Smoke trailed from multiple fires that had raged unchecked during the battle. The courtyard was strewn with bodies, too many to count. The stench of burnt flesh lingered, mingling with the biting cold. Pools of blackish dragon's blood stained the ground in several places, marking where Viserion and Rhaegal had fallen. Drogon lay near the remains of the stables, breathing but too weak to move. Those who still had strength began the sorrowful task of gathering the dead. The White Walkers themselves had disintegrated, leaving behind only shards of crystalline ice and tattered remnants of armor. The Whites had collapsed into bones and decaying flesh, now inert lumps in the snow. Yet the losses on the living side were immense. Ser Davos Seaworth and Podrick Payne organized makeshift infirmaries, triaging the wounded who filled every corridor. Arya, face streaked with soot, limped through the bodies, searching for survivors or anyone who needed help finishing off a dying White. She found Gendry in the courtyard, leaning against the battered scorpion, tears in his eyes, though relief softened his features when he saw her. Bran Stark was found near the Godswood, lying unconscious against the trunk of the weirwood tree, ravens perched around him. He had apparently expended too much energy warging into multiple creatures to disrupt the undead dragons. Sansa Stark, leading a group of medics, arrived breathless to find him. She cradled Bran's head, whispering reassurances. After some moments, he stirred, blinking as though coming out of a dream. Sansa nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, grateful he was alive. Amid the wreckage, Tyrion walked with Grey Worm, both battered but alive. They conferred on the immediate steps needed for survival: water, food, medicine. Winterfell was on the brink of collapse, and the unstoppable winter winds would only make matters worse. Grey Worm, stoic even in despair, silently took the measure of what remained of the Unsullied. Barely a fraction of their original number had survived. But as always, they would continue to follow Daenerys, if she lived. Near the ruined stable walls, Daenerys and Jon oversaw the efforts to treat Drogon. The magnificent dragon was the last of his kind now. He barely opened his eyes when Daenerys approached, as though even that small gesture cost him. She laid a hand on his hot scales, feeling the ragged rise and fall of his breath. "Stay with me," she whispered, tears tracking through the grime on her face. "You are my last child. We will find a way to heal you." Maesters who had joined their cause tended to Drogon's burns and gashes as best they could, applying salves made from rare herbs and melted snow. They had little knowledge of dragon physiology, but they tried. Jon watched Daenerys with quiet sympathy. He wished words could soothe her, but none came to him. Instead, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Finally, when the sun had risen higher, though hidden behind thick clouds, Daenerys turned to Jon. "So many lost, but we prevailed." He nodded, scanning the devastation. "A victory in name, but at a cost that will haunt us for generations." She exhaled shakily. "We must see that it was not in vain. The Night King is gone, truly gone. Westeros can rebuild." Her voice choked. I wish it hadn't cost Viserion and Rhaegal, and so many lives." Jon drew her against him, resting his cheek on her hair. For a moment, they found a stillness amid the ruin. A soft clearing of a throat interrupted them. Tyrion stood nearby, bandaged and pale. "We need your counsel, your grace. The people are frightened. Winterfell is in ruins, and supplies are scarce. We must decide where to rebuild or how to consolidate the survivors." Daenerys pulled away from Jon, wiping at her face. "We will gather everyone in the Great Hall, what remains of it, and plan." She paused, glancing at Drogon. "But first, see that he is made as comfortable as possible." Jon nodded. "I'll help." And so, in the broken remains of Winterfell, they began the slow process of fortifying what they could, burning the bodies of the dead to prevent any last flickers of necromancy from reviving them. Pits were dug for mass pyres. The living wept, prayed, and cursed. Yet they also found a grim resolve. After so many battles, so many heartbreaks, there was still life. And as long as life remained, hope endured. Late that afternoon, with a cold gray sun behind thick clouds, Daenerys and Jon, along with those lords and knights still capable of standing, assembled in the half-ruined Great Hall. The roof on one side had caved in, letting a wintry draft swirl around the gathering. Though it pained Daenerys to leave Drogon's side, she knew leadership was needed. She stood at the front, near the collapsed dais, while the survivors, Northerners, Vale Knights, the Hound with a rag around his arm, the remnants of the unsullied wildlings under Tormund, Brienne and Jaime, listened. Sansa, Tyrion, and Arya joined her, forming a small circle of command. Bran was still too weak to attend, but Sansa had spoken with him enough to convey his counsel. Daenerys drew in a breath, her voice raw. "The long night is ended. The Night King was destroyed, his army scattered to dust. We have lost cherished friends, allies, family. But we are alive. For that, we must press on. We will rebuild Winterfell. We will gather food and keep each other warm as the winter deepens. Our forces are few now, but our hearts remain strong." A rumble of agreement and exhaustion passed through those assembled. Jon stepped forward. "We may face other threats in the days to come. Rogue lords, opportunists who hear that Winterfell is weakened. We must stay vigilant. The dragons, only one remains, wounded. But he will heal, and we will stand united to defend the realm from any who would tear it apart." Tormund grunted. "I will stand. We didn't come this far to die cowering in a corner." Sansa's gaze swept the crowd. "We will also need to ensure the King's Road is kept open for supplies. The harvest in the Riverlands may help, if we can negotiate safe passage for trade caravans." Tyrion added, "We should send word to any lords who still honor their oaths. They need to know the threat of the White Walkers is over. Perhaps it will strengthen alliances." Jaime nodded slowly, though pain twisted his face. "We can't defend the entire North alone now, but if we can get reinforcements, if we show them that the undead threat is done, they might rally." The hounds snorted, leaning against a collapsed column. Bloody lot of them hid in their castles while we fought. But maybe they'll come sniffing for favors now. Daenerys's voice rose again, more certain this time, as though forging a path out of despair. Whatever their reasons, we need allies. We are the living, and we must stand together against whatever trials may come. If we are to survive the remainder of this winter and beyond, we need unity. She paused, letting the words sink in, then concluded, "Tend to the wounded, bury or burn the dead, fortify what we can of Winterfell. When Drogon recovers, we will use his fire to help forge new walls if we must. But let no one doubt, we have faced the greatest darkness and emerged victorious. Let that carry us through the hardships ahead." The assembly dispersed, each to their tasks. Over the following days, a grim but determined routine took shape. Broken walls were propped up with lumber salvaged from the ruins of the stable and nearby outbuildings. The stench of funeral pyres clung to the cold air as bodies were burned in massive pits outside the castle. Some wept openly, others stared blankly. Yet there was a pervasive sense that the worst horror, the unstoppable tide of death, was gone. Outside Winterfell's battered walls, the snowdrifts were stained with blood and ash, littered with broken weapons and the remains of fallen warriors. Ravens circled overhead, cawing forlornly. In the night sky, the aurora shimmered faintly, a final echo of the magic that had unleashed the long night. Now it gave only a cold radiance. Weeks passed. Daenerys spent most of her time ensuring Drogon's recovery, feeding him whatever livestock they could spare. Slowly, the black dragon gained strength, able to stand and move short distances. Sometimes, Jon found her by Drogon's side at dawn, singing soft lullabies in Viserion, tears slipping down her cheeks as she remembered her other two children. Jon, for his part, oversaw the training of new recruits, anyone in the north who could fight, from young boys to older men and women who'd never lifted a sword before. The victory had come at such a staggering cost that entire families had been wiped out. He found solace in action, in ensuring that those left behind had a measure of security. Sansa took on more administrative duties, orchestrating supply lines. She sent ravens south, urging lords to stand by the new era of peace. Some ravens never returned, lost to the storms. Still, she persisted. She also began to organize a marriage alliance for houses decimated by the war, helping them rebuild bonds and unify. Arya quietly slipped in and out of Winterfell. She never said where she went, but sometimes she returned with news of bandits or raiders who had threatened a nearby hamlet. Bandits who were now gone. People whispered that she was a ghost, the night wolf, appearing from the snow to deliver swift justice. Bran, recovering from his own exertion, spent many days in the God's Wood, silent. Once, Daenerys approached him, seeking counsel about the future. Bran only murmured that she and Jon still had a destiny to fulfill, that the realm would need leaders of wisdom and compassion. His distant gaze was as inscrutable as ever. As the deeper winter set in, the battered walls of Winterfell held firm. More survivors trickled in from the countryside, telling tales of villages overrun by whites who collapsed the moment the Night King died, leaving the farmers traumatized but alive. Jon and Tormund organized rescue parties, bringing them to the castle for shelter. One bitter day, messengers arrived from the Vale and the Riverlands. They brought wagons of grain and salted meats, enough to sustain Winterfell's population for a month or more. With them came knights to bolster the defenses, though the war was over. The fear of the undead still lingered, but hearing that the threat was truly ended, these southern lords saw an opportunity to curry favor with the new Targaryen monarchy in the north. Daenerys received them politely, though she felt her old fire stirring, resentment that they had not come when the Night King first advanced, that they had not helped sooner. But war and politics rarely bent to righteous indignation, so she accepted the supplies graciously, focusing on the bigger picture: survival and unity. Days turned into weeks, and the realm began to sense the shift. Word spread that Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow, whispered by some to be Aegon Targaryen, had ended the Great War. The southern houses, some still reeling from the aftermath of Cersei Lannister's downfall, For this was not long after that conflict hesitantly sent envoys. Spring was still a distant dream, but an uneasy peace settled over the land. Inside Winterfell, the scars of battle would remain for generations. The outer walls bore cracks and scorch marks where undead dragons had unleashed their frosty flames. Stone towers, once proud, stood half-ravaged. Yet, with each repaired wall, each gathered harvest, a sense of renewal bloomed. Children ran in the courtyard again, playing among the rubble. Old men recounted tales of the long night, how they had survived certain doom. In the center of it all, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow walked side by side. Their bond had been tested by grief, loss, and the revelation of Jon's heritage. But in the face of the near apocalypse, petty concerns faded. They found solace in each other, forging a partnership steeped in mutual respect and shared pain. Some nights, they would stand on the walls together, gazing at the wide northern sky. Daenerys often felt the pang of heartbreak remembering Viserion and Rhaegal, but she would lay her head against Jon's shoulder, grateful for what remained. Drogon, in time, managed to fly short distances outside the castle. His injuries were severe, and his flight was not as swift or agile as before, but the skies of the north once again felt the thunder of his wings. His roars echoed over the frosty plains, a testament that dragons still lived in Westeros. People grew more comfortable with his presence, though always with a measure of awe and respect. Eventually, as the year crept on, the deep winter gave small signs of easing. The storms, while still brutal, became less frequent. Some days the sun shone, weak but present, upon the battered fortress. Streams of meltwater trickled from the ramparts. Sansa's network of alliances bore fruit, with supply wagons arriving more regularly. Wooden beams and stone blocks were brought in, rebuilding the main gate. Bit by bit, Winterfell was restored to a semblance of its former glory, albeit with fresh scars that no one wished to forget. The memory of that cataclysmic night, when the Night King arrived with 2 undead dragons, lingered in the hearts of every survivor. Around hearth fires, storytellers wove legends of how the final stand had played out. That moment when Jon Snow plunged Longclaw into the Night King's chest. How Daenerys Targaryen had lost 2 dragons but saved the realm with her last. The details became embellished, woven into songs that bards carried to distant corners of the 7 kingdoms. Some sang of Arya Stark, the wolf girl who leapt at the Night King, or of Bran Stark, the mystic Raven Lord guiding flocks to blind the undead. Others sang of a battered Jaime Lannister helping to fire the final scorpion bolt. The living recounted all these tales, ensuring the memory would not fade with the melting snows. And so, in time, Westeros began to heal. The Great War ended not with the unstoppable conquest of death, but with a battered coalition of the living standing victorious. The nightmares would linger in the minds of those who fought, in every new crack in Winterfell's rebuilt walls, in every hush of wind across the ghostly battlefields of the north. Yet day by day, light returned. Daenerys often dreamed of Rhaegal and Viserion. She saw them soaring in a warm sky, free of the undead corruption that had claimed them. In those dreams, she flew with them on Drogon's back, as though they were a family once more. She would wake to a dull ache in her chest, but that ache drove her to protect what remained, to honor the sacrifice of those she lost. Drogon sensed her mourning. He would nuzzle her gently, letting out a low rumble that almost sounded like a lament. Jon Snow, too, wrestled with the shadows of that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he felt the bone-numbing cold of the Night King's presence. He remembered the moment he thought he would die, and the unnatural strength he faced. Sometimes he was awoken by nightmares of Rhaegal's undead visage bearing down on him with those icy flames. But in his waking hours, he wore a resolute face, guiding the North's recovery. If the realm was to find peace, it would need leadership unafraid of old ghosts. The cost of victory had been staggering, but the living had proven that unity could overcome even the darkest foe. The legend of the Long Night reclaimed an honored place in the histories, as it once again had been banished, this time hopefully forever. And though Westeros bore new scars, it also carried a new sense of possibility. If they could defy the end of all life, what else might they achieve together? In the quiet hush of a dawn long after the final battle, Daenerys stood on the repaired battlements, gazing north. The horizon remained blanketed with snow, but there was a faint glimmer of sunrise coloring the sky pale gold. Drogon perched on a lower section of wall, his gaze scanning the skies, as though seeking lost siblings. Daenerys placed a hand on his flank, feeling the strength of his heartbeat. Jon approached from behind, placing a fur cloak around her shoulders. They stood together, letting the cold wind whip their hair. The first rays of sun broke over the clouds, illuminating the battered towers of Winterfell. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daenerys whispered, voice thick with emotion, "They didn't break us." Jon wrapped an arm around her waist. "No," he said softly, "they did not." And so began the new chapter for the North and for all Westeros. In the aftermath of the unimaginable, the survivors found that life, fragile and precious, continues. Each sunrise was a victory. Each shared meal, a testament to resilience. The memory of the undead dragons, Rhaegal and Viserion, soared through the ballads and the hush of the wind, but it would not define them. They were defined by their unity, their perseverance, and the warm spark of life that refused to be snuffed out. That, in the end, was the living's greatest triumph.